The macabre history of the Penbrookes. They kept 10 kids in a flooded basement in the heart of rural Vermont, where autumn mists cling to rolling hills and forgotten roads wind through dense forests. Stands a monument to decay that the locals call simply the Penbrooke Place. For 3 generations, this imposing Victorian mansion had cast its shadow over the small town of Millbrook Falls, its Gothic spires piercing the sky like accusing fingers. The Penbrooke family had once been the town's crown jewel. Edmund Penbrooke, the patriarch who built the mansion in 1887, had made his fortune in timber and railroad investments. His success had transformed Millbrook Falls from a forgotten logging camp into a thriving community. The Penbrookes were benefactors, philanthropists, and pillars of society. Their annual Christmas galas were legendary, their charitable contributions substantial, and their reputation beyond reproach. But respectability, as the town would learn, can be the most dangerous mask of all. By the autumn of 2019, the mansion had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. Its once pristine white walls had yellowed and peeled, revealing rotting wood beneath. Windows stared out like hollow eyes, their glass cracked and clouded with age. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect, and ivy had claimed the eastern wall entirely, creating an organic shroud that seemed to pulse with secrets. The last of the Penbrooke line, Helena Penbrooke Morrison, had died in a Boston nursing home in 1999, taking with her the keys to a mystery that had haunted Millbrook Falls for generations. Local children had long whispered stories about the mansion, tales of strange sounds echoing from within, of lights flickering in windows of an empty house, and of something terrible lurking in the basement. These weren't merely the fantasies of young minds seeking thrills. The stories had roots that ran deeper than anyone imagined. Detective Sarah Chun of the Vermont State Police had heard the whispers throughout her childhood in Millbrook Falls. Now, 25 years later, she found herself standing at the rusted iron gates of the Penbrooke estate, holding a court order that would finally allow investigators to explore the property. The catalyst for this long overdue investigation had come from an unexpected source. Construction workers hired to demolish the mansion had made a discovery that would shake the small town to its very foundations. The workers had been preparing the basement for demolition when they noticed something peculiar about the flooring. What appeared to be a concrete slab showed signs of having been poured in sections, with subtle variations in color and texture that suggested different installation dates. More disturbing were the drain systems, an elaborate network of pipes and channels that seemed designed not for typical basement water management, but for something far more sinister. When jackhammers broke through the newer sections of concrete, the workers expected to find the typical debris of old construction. Instead, they found horror. The basement revealed a labyrinthine network of rooms, each approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, constructed with meticulous care and disturbing purpose. The walls were lined with moisture-resistant materials, and each room contained drainage systems that connected to a central pumping mechanism. Most chilling of all were the modifications clearly designed for human occupancy: crude sleeping platforms, rudimentary sanitation facilities, and heavy doors that could only be locked from the outside. But it was what the forensic team discovered. Next, it transformed whispered fears into documented nightmare. In the flooded sections of the basement, where decades of groundwater seepage had created a brackish, stagnant pool, investigators found the first bones. Small bones. The bones of children. Dr. Amanda Foster, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, had seen her share of disturbing crime scenes, but nothing had prepared her for what lay beneath the Penbrooke mansion. As her team carefully excavated the waterlogged basement, they uncovered evidence of a systematic horror that had operated for decades. The initial bone discoveries led to a comprehensive excavation that would take months to complete. Layer by layer, the basement revealed its secrets. The forensic team found evidence suggesting that at least 10 children, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 14 years old, had died in those basement rooms over a span of several decades. The construction of the basement prison showed a level of planning that was as methodical as it was malevolent. The rooms had been built in stages, with the oldest sections dating back to the early 1920s, and the newest additions completed sometime in the 1960s. Each room showed signs of repeated use and maintenance, suggesting a long-term operation rather than a single tragic event. Even more disturbing were the personal effects recovered from the sealed chambers. Children's clothing from different eras, toys that spanned decades of changing fashions, and handwritten notes scratched into the walls with fingernails or makeshift tools. These messages, when translated by linguistic experts, painted a picture of prolonged captivity, desperation, and ultimately, hopelessness. One message, carved deep into the wooden wall of what investigators designated as Room 7, would haunt everyone who read it. "Mama, I tried to be good. I promise I tried. Please, come find me before the water comes back." The water. This recurring theme in the children's writings provided the key to understanding the Penbrookes' method of murder. The basement's flooding wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The elaborate drainage system could be controlled manually, allowing the basement rooms to be flooded and drained at will. Forensic evidence suggested that the children had been subjected to repeated cycles of flooding, creating a form of psychological torture that combined claustrophobia, hypothermia, and the terror of slow drowning. As news of the discovery spread through Millbrook Falls, longtime residents began connecting dots that had remained scattered for generations. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, now 87 and the town's unofficial historian, remembered stories her grandmother had told about children who had gone missing. Over the years, not just from Millbrook Falls, but from surrounding communities as well, these weren't the high-profile disappearances that make national news. They were the invisible children, runaways from broken homes, orphans from overcrowded institutions, immigrant children whose families were too marginalized to demand thorough investigations. The Penbrookes had selected their victims with calculated precision, choosing those whose absence would cause the least scrutiny. The family's public philanthropy had provided perfect cover for their private atrocities. The Penbrookes had funded orphanages, supported struggling families, and championed children's causes throughout their prominence in the community. This charitable facade had given them access to vulnerable children while simultaneously building a reputation that made suspicion almost impossible. But how had they maintained such a terrible secret for so long? The answer lay in understanding the dynamics of small-town life in early to mid-20th century America, where social hierarchies were rigid and the wealthy were rarely questioned by those dependent upon their largesse. As Detective Chun delved deeper into historical records, she discovered that several investigations into missing children over the decades had been mysteriously closed or redirected. Police reports from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s showed a pattern of disappearances that investigators at the time had attributed to the social upheaval of the Great Depression and World War II. Children were often assumed to have run away to larger cities or been claimed by the general chaos of the era. The Penbrooke family had wielded their influence carefully, using their wealth and social standing to deflect suspicion and silence questions. They had donated generously to the Police Benevolent Fund, served on community boards, and maintained friendships with judges, mayors, and other influential figures who might otherwise have asked uncomfortable questions. The basement excavation continued through the harsh Vermont winter, with investigators working in heated tents to protect both the evidence and themselves from the brutal cold. Each new discovery added another piece to a puzzle of unimaginable cruelty that had operated in plain sight for nearly half a century. As Chapter 1 of this investigation drew to a close, Detective Chun stood in the mansion's grand foyer, looking up at oil paintings of the Penbrook family that still hung on the faded wallpaper. Their faces, captured in oils with the dignity befitting their social station, seemed to mock the horror that lay beneath their feet. The contrast between the family's public image and their private reality represented one of the most profound betrayals of trust in American criminal history. But the investigation was far from over. The basement had yielded its initial secrets, but many questions remained unanswered. How exactly had the Penbrookes acquired their victims? Who else in the community might have been complicit? And perhaps most disturbing of all, were there other locations, other basements, other families who had used their respectability as a shield for unthinkable crimes? The answers to these questions would emerge in the investigation's second phase, as Detective Chun and her team prepared to unravel not just the mechanics of the Penbrookes crimes, but the systematic failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. The spring of 2020 brought more than just the end of Vermont's harsh winter to Millbrook Falls. As snow melted from the hills surrounding the Penbrooke mansion, it seemed to wash away decades of willful blindness that had shrouded the town's darkest secret. The basement excavation was complete, but the investigation had only just begun to reveal the full scope of the horror that had operated beneath the veneer of respectability. Detective Chun's team had expanded to include specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, historians specializing in missing persons cases, and genealogists tasked with identifying the victims whose remains had been recovered. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic predation that had operated with chilling efficiency across multiple generations of the Penbrooke family. The forensic timeline revealed that the basement prison had been active from approximately 1923 to 1967, a span of 44 years that encompassed the reigns of three different Penbrook patriarchs. Edmund Penbrook, the mansion's builder, had died in 1922, apparently before the basement's darker purpose had been implemented. It was his son, Theodore Penbrook, who had overseen the construction of the first basement cells in the early 1920s. Theodore had been a pillar of the community, serving on the school board and founding what would become the area's largest children's home. His public dedication to child welfare had provided perfect cover for his private predation. When Theodore died in 1951, his son Marcus had continued the family's terrible tradition until his own death in 1967, at which point the basement rooms had been permanently sealed with concrete. The investigation into how the Penbrookes had acquired their victims revealed a network of complicity that extended far beyond the family itself. Records recovered from various institutions showed a pattern of children being transferred to Penbrooke care through official channels. Orphanages would receive generous donations, followed by requests to house specific children temporarily. At the Penbrooke estate, these children, typically those with behavioral problems or no living relatives, would simply disappear from all records. Dr. James Morrison, a psychiatrist specializing in historical criminal psychology, analyzed the family's methods and found them disturbingly sophisticated. The Penbrookes had understood that their victims needed to be children who wouldn't be missed, and they had developed an entire infrastructure to identify and acquire such victims. They maintained relationships with overcrowded orphanages, juvenile detention facilities, and even traveling circuses were abandoned. Children often ended up. The basement itself revealed the evolution of their methods over time. The earliest rooms, built in the 1920s, were crude affairs with basic containment features. But as the decades progressed, the construction became more sophisticated. Later rooms included soundproofing materials, more elaborate drainage systems, and even primitive ventilation that could be controlled from above. This suggested that the Penbrookes had learned from experience, refining their methods to maximize both the suffering of their victims and their own security. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what investigators termed the observation rooms, spaces built into the basement ceiling structure where the Penbrookes could watch their victims without being seen. These rooms contained comfortable chairs, blankets, and even refreshments, suggesting that the family members had spent considerable time observing the children they had imprisoned. The forensic analysis of the victims' remains provided heartbreaking insights into their final days. Evidence of malnutrition was universal, indicating that the children had been kept alive for extended periods under conditions of deliberate starvation. Bone analysis revealed patterns of healing fractures, suggesting that physical abuse had been systematic rather than occasional. Most disturbing of all were signs that some victims had been subjected to medical experiments, possibly conducted by Marcus Penbrooke, who had trained as a physician before taking over the family business. As the investigation progressed, Detective Chun began to uncover evidence of a broader network of complicity within Millbrook Falls itself. Bank records showed regular payments to several town officials during the decades when the basement was active. Police logs from the era revealed an unusual pattern of cases being closed without resolution, particularly those involving missing children or reports of suspicious activity at the Penbrooke estate. The town's collective amnesia about the Penbrooke crimes wasn't entirely natural. It had been carefully cultivated and financially maintained. The family had essentially purchased the silence of those in positions to investigate or question their activities. This corruption had created a bubble of protection around their crimes that had persisted, even after the basement had been sealed. Modern forensic techniques allowed investigators to identify 7 of the 10 victims whose remains were recovered. These children had come from across New England, with some traveling hundreds of miles before disappearing into the Penbrooke basement. Their ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds varied widely, but all shared the common tragedy of being society's most vulnerable members, those whose disappearance would cause minimal disruption to the adult world. Among the identified victims was Thomas McKenna, age 8, who had disappeared from a Boston orphanage in 1934. Records showed that the orphanage had received a substantial donation from Theodore Penbrook just weeks before Thomas vanished. Another victim, Maria Santos, had been taken from her immigrant family in 1942 under the pretext of providing her with better educational opportunities. Her family had been told she was being sent to a prestigious boarding school, when in reality she had been delivered to the basement prison where she would spend her final months. The psychological profiles of the Penbrooke perpetrators revealed classic patterns of inherited psychopathy, combined with the unique opportunities provided by wealth and social standing. Each generation had passed down not just the family's legitimate business interests, but also their methods of selecting, acquiring, and disposing of victims. This represented one of the first documented cases of multi-generational organized child abuse operating within a single family structure. Dr. Foster's team made one final, particularly disturbing discovery as they completed their excavation. Hidden within the mansion's walls, they found Theodore Penbrook's private journals, detailed records of each victim, their backgrounds, their time in captivity, and ultimately their deaths. These journals, written in a careful, methodical hand, revealed the clinical detachment with which the Penbrookes had approached their crimes. The journals also contained sketches and photographs that documented the basement's evolution over time, as well as detailed notes about the psychological effects of different forms of torture on their victims. These materials suggested that the Penbrookes had viewed their crimes not just as entertainment, but as a form of research into human suffering and endurance. The final entries in Marcus Penbrooke's journals, dated 1967, revealed his growing concern about changing social attitudes and investigative techniques that might expose the family's activities. His decision to seal the basement permanently had apparently been motivated by practical rather than moral concerns. He feared that modernizing law enforcement methods would eventually uncover their crimes. When the investigation concluded in the fall of 2020, Detective Chun found herself grappling with questions that extended far beyond the specific crimes of the Penbrooke family. How many other wealthy, respected families had used their social standing to conceal similar atrocities? How many vulnerable children had disappeared into private horrors, while their communities chose to look the other way? The Penbrooke mansion was ultimately demolished, its foundations excavated and the contaminated soil removed for proper disposal. In its place, the town of Millbrook Falls established a memorial garden dedicated to all missing children, with special recognition for the 10 victims, whose remains had been recovered from the basement. The case prompted legislative changes in Vermont and several other states, establishing new protocols for investigating missing children cases and creating oversight mechanisms for private institutions that house vulnerable youth. The Penbrooke investigation had revealed that respectability could be the most dangerous disguise, and that society's most vulnerable members were often victimized by those who publicly claimed to protect them. Today, Millbrook Falls continues to grapple with the legacy of the Penbrooke crimes. The town has established counseling services for residents struggling to reconcile their memories of the prestigious family with the reality of their actions. Community leaders have committed to ensuring that such crimes could never again be hidden by wealth, influence, or social standing. The macabre history of the Penbrookes serves as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind facades of respectability, and that true justice requires the courage to question even the most honored members of society. Their story stands as a testament to the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members and maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit positions of trust and authority. In the end, the Penbrooke family's carefully constructed legacy of philanthropy and civic leadership was overshadowed entirely by the horror they had concealed. Their name, once synonymous with prestige and community service, became forever associated with one of America's most systematic and prolonged cases of child abuse and murder. The basement that had once imprisoned 10 innocent children now lies filled with concrete and earth, but the memory of their suffering continues to remind us that vigilance and justice must never be sacrificed to comfort and complacency. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious